Hello everyone. Today we would look at chapter 8, which talks about cost and revenue. All right. It is necessary for us as students of economics to understand the concept of cost and the concept of revenue. For our lesson today, we would have to achieve the following objectives. 3 objectives. The first objective is to understand what is the meaning of cost. Also, we have to understand the different types and classifications of cost, and we should also be able to calculate the different types of cost. And finally, we have to understand and explain the concept of revenue. So, the 3 objectives of our lesson today. So, the first is okay. So, these are the objectives of our lesson for today. Understand the meaning of cost, know the different types of costs, be able to calculate the different types of cost, understand and explain the concept of revenue. So let's begin with the meaning of costs. So, what is cost? Cost simply refers to the expenditure we make when we buy factors of production which we use to produce goods and services. So any factor of production which we buy or we purchase or we hire, the money we spend on purchasing or hiring factors of production and raw material, that amount of money spent, that expenditure is what we consider as cost. So, what are the different types of cost? We would look at 4 types of cost. The first type of cost we would look at is known as the fixed cost. So I will just write down the 4 types of costs which we are expected to know, and then we will discuss each one after the other and learn how to calculate each of them. So we have the fixed cost. Next, we have the variable cost. We have the explicit cost. And lastly, we have the implicit cost. So these are the 4 types of cost we are expected to know, able to explain and calculate. So the first is the fixed cost, the variable cost, the explicit cost, and the implicit cost. So what then do we mean by the fixed cost? What is the meaning of fixed cost? So we already said costs represents the money expenditure which we incur when we produce goods. So fixed cost, therefore, represents the money expenditure. Fixed cost represents the money expenditure on hiring or purchasing fixed factors of production. Those factors of production which do not change when our output is changing. So any money which is spent on buying a factor of production which doesn't change when output is changing, that expenditure is considered as fixed costs. We can have an example of fixed costs like rent, the rent of a building where the production is taking place. No matter how many units of output which we produce, we still have to pay the same amount of rent. So that rent, which is the expenditure we pay for the building which we use, we will consider that as fixed cost. So it is money expenditure on fixed factor inputs. It's money expenditure on fixed factor inputs which do not change with output. This is what is known as fixed costs. Money expenditure on fixed factor inputs which do not change with output. And I've given you an example. We have an example like rent. Those are expenditures that do not change with with output. So next type of cost we would look at is the variable cost. What is variable cost? Now, on the other hand, fixed cost represents money expenditure on factors of production, on raw materials, on factors of production which do not change when output is changing. On the other hand, variable cost represents money expenditure on factors of production which change when output is changing. So this is money expenditure So this is money expenditure on variable factors of production which change when output is changing. So this is what is considered as variable cost. It is money expenditure on variable factors of production. Thus, variable factors of production are factors of production which change when output is changing. An example of a variable factor of production is labor. If you want to produce more of any good, be it more cars, more agricultural products like fruits, you need to hire more laborers in order to produce more output. So the more laborers you hire, the more money expenditure you would incur in order to produce more output. That is why we consider that as variable factor of production, because as you are changing the number of laborers, the output is also changing. So the money you spend, the money expenditure or the cost on this variable factor also changes. The next type of cost is explicit cost. So what is explicit cost? Explicit cost represents the money expenditure which any producer or supplier of a product or a commodity makes on all the factors of production, be it variable factor or fixed factor. That is the actual spending, the actual money spending which is incurred when we either buy factors of production or we hire factors of production. It does not matter if the factor of production is fixed or variable. So it is the money expenditure, that which you can actually count in monetary terms. That is what we call explicit cost. Like rent is an explicit cost, wages, explicit cost, the cost of raw materials, explicit cost, because you can count how much you actually spend on buying or hiring the factor of production. So explicit cost, this is actual money spent So, explicit cost, this is the actual money spent or the actual expenditure, either buying or hiring all factors or production. That is what we consider as explicit cost. The actual money that you spend in putting together all the factors of production, be it variable factor of production or fixed factor of production. And our last type of cost is the implicit cost. What is the implicit cost? So, what is implicit cost? Before we get to the definition of what implicit cost is, I would like us to review something a little. Now, if you are a producer or a supplier and you have some of the factors of production, you own some of the factors of production, it would not be wise for you to go around buying the same factor of production which you already own. As a business or an economist, you would be very wise to use some of those resources, those factors of production which you already own in producing whatever you want to produce. Now, what we call implicit cost is a value which you would have, that's the amount of money you would have spent if you did not own those factors of production. If you had to buy the factors of production that you own to use in the production of a good or a service, that amount of money which you have saved because you did not have to buy that factor of production is what we consider as implicit cost. In other words, it's some form of opportunity cost because you are using factors of production which you own. You are supplying it to your own business, you are supplying it to the process of production to produce goods and services rather than going to buy what you already own. So the money which you would have spent or the money which you would have gotten from giving that factors of production out, that is what we consider as implicit cost. Take, for example, you are producing sandwiches and you use your home to produce the sandwiches and sell. Now, if you had decided to give that home out for rent, that money would have been income to you. But now you are not getting the income because you are using your own house to produce the goods and services. That represents what we call implicit cost. So, what is implicit cost? Implicit cost, we can simply define it as this is cost So, We can define implicit cost as costs which result from losing money from owner-supplied factors of production. Those assets, those factors of production which the owner of a business had, and he decides to use it in his business. Those factors of production would have been earning him money, but he decided to use it in a business. Let's take, for example, you own a car, and you decide to use the car in producing a certain good and service. You have lost money if you decided to give the car out for rent. That car would have been giving you income as rent by giving it to somebody who may use it for his own private purpose or may use it for taxi. That car would have been giving you money. But because you decided to use that car to produce your own goods and services, you are losing the money which would have been coming from that car. So that money which you are losing is an example of implicit cost. Okay, before we move to revenue, we will just talk about one last aspect and do a little calculations. Now, what do we mean by total costs? Total cost. Total cost represents all the expenditures which we incur when we are producing goods or service. When we add all the costs together, which we incur before we produce a good or a service, that total amount of cost, the total amount of spending, the total amount of expenditure is what we call total cost. So total cost represents all the money, all the expenditure which we incur in producing goods and services. Therefore, total cost is the cost of all explicit costs put together, be it fixed cost or variable cost. Therefore, total cost is equal to total fixed cost plus total variable cost. So if we add the fixed cost to the variable cost, we will have the total cost. So total cost can be abbreviated. TC is equal to total fixed cost abbreviated, total fixed cost, and total variable cost abbreviated, TVC. So this is the formula which we use to calculate the total cost. The total cost is the sum of the total fixed cost and the total variable cost. When we add the total fixed cost, which is the expenditure, the money expenditure we make on fixed factors of production, and we add it together with the money expenditure we make on variable factors of production, it will give us the total cost. All right. Now, the next type of cost we will look at is what is called the average cost. Average cost. What is the average cost? If a business produces 500 units of output, the average cost will represent the cost of producing 1 unit of such output. So, by calculation, the average cost represents average cost is equal to the total cost divided by the total quantity of output that has been produced. So average cost is total cost divided by the total units produced. So for example, if a business produces, for example, if a business produces cakes, 500 cakes, and spends a total cost and spends 2,000 dinar, then the average cost, which is abbreviated AC, The average cost, which is abbreviated AC, will be 2,000 divided by 500. So it means it costs 4 dinar to produce 1 cake. That is what average cost means. The cost of producing 1 unit of an output. So we have 500 units cost us 2,000. Now, 1 unit will cost us 4 dinar. That is the meaning of average cost. Average cost is the cost of producing 1 unit of output. So the last type of cost which we would look at is called the marginal cost. This is very interesting. Marginal cost. What is the marginal cost? The marginal cost can be defined as the cost, the increase in the total cost resulting from the increase of 1 more unit of output. That means how much will total cost change when you increase production by 1 more unit? That is what we consider as the marginal cost. So the marginal cost, this is the increase. This is the increase in total cost. This is the increase in total cost by producing 1 more unit of output. That is what marginal cost is. It is the increase in total cost by producing 1 more unit of output. So we want to see how much will total cost increase if we increase production by 1 more unit. That value is what we consider as the marginal cost. So this sums it up for the different types of cost. So summarily, we have fixed cost, variable cost, explicit cost, implicit cost, average cost, and finally the marginal cost. Chapter 8 looks at costs and revenue. Now, we already know what is cost and the different types of costs. We know what is total cost, and we know what is average cost, and we know what is marginal cost. Now, we would move to the concept of revenue. What is revenue? What is revenue? Revenue simply is the amount of money you get from selling goods and services. The total amount of money you get from selling goods and services, that is what we consider as revenue. So, revenue is the amount of money obtained from selling goods or services. Just like how we studied cost, we saw the different types of cost, we will also see the different types of revenue. Types of revenue. We would look at just two types of revenue. The first type is the average revenue, and next we would look at the marginal revenue. So these are the two types of revenue which we would study. First, average revenue. Next, the marginal revenue. The question then is, let's begin with the first one. What is the average revenue? What is the average revenue? The average revenue simply is the amount of revenue you get from selling 1 unit of a product. Just 1 unit of a product. Whatever amount of money you get by selling 1 unit of a product, that represents the average revenue. And next, we have the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue looks at how much the total revenue changes. How much the total revenue changes when you sell 1 more product. So, in other words, let it be known that we always abbreviate the average revenue as AR. So what is average revenue? We have said the average revenue is the amount of money you get from selling 1 unit of a product. In other words, the price and the average revenue of a product are the same if the price is constant. All right. Now, the next is marginal revenue. We've said marginal revenue is the additional revenue. It is the increase in total revenue when we sell more additional units of a product. And this will bring us to the last type of revenue, which is the total revenue. Total revenue. Total revenue simply represents the total amount of money you get from selling a certain number of units of a product. When you sell a certain number of units of a product, the total amount of money you get from selling the quantity of a product represents the total revenue. And the total revenue can be calculated using the formula which I'll write on the board. So, total revenue is abbreviated TR. Whenever you see TR, it means total revenue. So, total revenue can be calculated as the price multiplied by the quantity. So, total revenue is equal to price multiplied by the quantity. So, total revenue is equal to price, P, which stands for price, times the quantity. So the more you sell, the more units of a product you sell, the more revenue you would get, because total revenue is the price multiplied by the quantity. So this brings us to the formula for calculating the average revenue. So how do we calculate the average revenue? So, the average revenue, this is the formula for calculating the average revenue, which is the total revenue divided by the quantity. So, the average revenue, we have already seen total revenue is equal to price times quantity. So, we replace total revenue with price times quantity, and we have a Q here. So, this will cancel out this, and we will be left with average revenue is equal to price. That's why we said from the beginning that the average revenue is the same as the price, and this justifies it. So this brings us to the end of the types of revenue. And the last thing, which brings into connection the cost and revenue. What is the relationship between cost and revenue? When we look at this formula, total revenue minus total cost, it is expected to give us what we know as profit. This is the reason why most businesses or firms are involved in production, because they want profit. Profit is the positive difference between the total revenue and the total cost. When the total revenue is greater than the total cost, then we have profit, which is a positive value. Profit, which is positive value. And this is what businesses are after. But when the total revenue is less than the total cost, it means the business is making a loss. The business is making a loss from production. That is a negative value. So profit is the aim or the goal of production. And we only have profit when our total revenue is greater than total cost. Thank you.